To have lived in fear of the Ripper is to comprehend hysteria which confuses relief with a desire for revenge. And understand the extent of grief.
People mustn't forget the victims, such as Dave and myself and Mr. and Mrs. Hill, the children particularly that he's orphaned, and the 5 years of terror the women in that area went through.
Die! Die! Die!
A man is charged with a Ripper murder. His wife and his father go with him to court.
There was a great deal of noisy shouting, much of it...
The man who for 5 years had killed and attacked women was caught at last. The news was good, but little consolation. This mother lost too much. Her daughter's death at the age of 16 was more than a single tragedy. It effectively destroyed a family. Her grave stands as a simple but stark reminder of what was lost.
The police came in and said, "Are you the father of Jane MacDonald?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I'll kill her when she comes home because she didn't phone last night." You know, every so long she used to stay out with one of her mates on a Saturday night. And we always saw her on a Sunday dinner time, but she phoned up, you know. And this time she hadn't, and...
He was more vexed because she hadn't
And
phoned.
I just said, "I'll kill her when she comes in, you know, for not phoning." And they said, "You may not have to." And that's as much as I knew. If this had been just... if she'd have died of, you know, illness or accident, but when it happens like it did, mutilation and everything, I went to identify her, and I just collapsed there and then.
I mean, they said he'd seen everything in the war, but nothing like that. When you were looking at your own flesh and blood, you know, I didn't have to do it. I don't think I could have.
I had to retire early. The kid is, well, he's murdered the whole family, you can more or less say.
Within days, Mr. MacDonald died, his family say of a broken heart. It began in 1975. As attack followed attack, a picture slowly emerged of a man who killed without discrimination. Prostitutes, teenagers, students, mothers with families. Any woman was at risk from attacks which were sudden, vicious, random and unpredictable. As the death toll mounted, terrifying rumors spread about what he had done to the women he had killed. To the women of the north of England, it seemed as though nothing short of a monster was on the rampage, and nothing could stop him. The police were baffled by a killer with no motive. Scotland Yard was just as helpless as the local force. The survivors of the Ripper's attacks will bear the scars for the rest of their lives. But these perhaps are not as deep as the anguish left behind in the families of those who died. Like the parents of the last victim, Jacqueline Hill, a university student attacked and killed in Leeds.
I know we went through the funeral, but that just seems like play acting. The hardest part is...
Well...
But I know that never more will she open our front door, step in and shout, "I'm home," and dump a large bag of washing to be done on the floor. I keep hoping perhaps at the weekend she'd come back.
And the parents of another student, Barbara Leach.
When Barbara died, my wife bought herself a new outfit to wear for the funeral, and it was rather expensive, and I raised my eyebrows at the price. But as she said then, it's not just for Barbara's funeral that that I was wearing this. It's for her graduation and her wedding and the birth of her babies. That's what's been taken from us, our future.
It's such a waste. You know, I don't like to think of what I'm losing. I'd rather generalise. If I think of Barbara too deeply.
And how do you feel about the fact that one man has caused all that misery?
Angry. Very angry. When I think of... He knew he was going to kill them. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. He must never come out. Ever.
Peter William Sutcliffe posed a threat to women and a threat to an entire police force. For 5 years, he was the man critics said the West Yorkshire force could never catch. And with those 5 years came enormous strains on manpower and morale. The inquiry got bigger and bigger with no result. Public pressure on the police mounted. They faced criticism and even ridicule. Apparently outwitted, they were driven to express their private fears in public.
I have always held the view that this man will continue to kill until he is caught. No woman is safe whilst he's at large.
Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield, the head of the Ripper inquiry for nearly all the 5 years, the man who regarded it as his personal mission to bring the Ripper to justice.
What's happening? Isn't much traffic tonight?
No, it's very quiet, sir, actually.
We're doing our best. We want him as much as you do. More so.
The strain of the challenge proved too much. He suffered 2 heart attacks and retired from the case for several months. But it wasn't just the men at the top who felt the strain. A spell on the Ripper beat became a recipe for disrupted private lives and even broken marriages. It was an investigation some young policemen grew up with.
The strain was quite tremendous at the time because we had our first baby at the time of the first murder, and he's 6 now. He knows about the Ripper. He can spot a Ripper's handwriting poster from 20 yards. He talks to me about the Ripper like he watches a programme on television. It's a character. He doesn't realise just what strain is put on people and terror is put amongst women in West Yorkshire. It got to be a way of life. We were living with him from day to day, thinking, this is it forever. Somehow we're never going to get him. I always felt that we would. Somewhere a mistake would be made.
5.5 years after the first attack, the police in West Yorkshire were able to announce that that mistake had been made. A man had been caught.
He is being questioned in relation to the Yorkshire Ripper murders.
Is it fair, then, to say that the general hunt for the so-called Yorkshire Ripper is now being wound down?
Right. I can tell you that we are absolutely delighted with developments at this stage. Absolutely delighted.
Can you all smile?
Really delighted.
Can you get a bit closer?
George is delighted as well.
Can you get a bit closer together, please? Can you get closer together?
Yes, absolutely delighted.
The next day, the newspapers joined in the euphoria and made it clear that the police thought they had got their man. But Peter Sutcliffe's father, John Sutcliffe, a mill worker, had no inkling of what had happened in Dewsbury.
Well, it was in the office on the Monday morning, and some of the fellows in the office were talking. And as I walked in, one of them said, well, this could be a relation of John's. And then another one said, have you a brother called Peter? I said, no, I've got a son called Peter. Does he live at Eton? I said, yes, he does. Whereupon one of the chaps passed the morning paper across with a picture of his house on the front page, which I recognised immediately, and his name and address printed in the column below. And I just said, oh, my God. And I said, Eddie, this is my boy. And then I went into a near state of collapse. I managed to stagger into the manager's office, told him what had happened. He sat me down, made me a pot of tea. And then the mill manager ran me home to my daughters. When I got there, of course, they knew about it all. And everybody was in an intense state of shock.
Did you ever suspect Peter might be responsible?
No way. No. No more than any other father would have suspected his own son. It had to be somebody's son. The fact that it was mine has been very, very traumatic. A terrible shock to all of us. Terrible shock. If you'd have known him, you would have realized that he was probably the last person in the world that you'd have suspected of having any sort of mental aberrations which would cause him to do these things.
Why do you say that? I mean, he is your son. Don't people naturally think you will protect him and stand up for him?
People probably do think that I'm saying this because I'm his father. But, as you say, he was my son. He's still my son. As long as I'm alive, he'll still be my son. I'm not trying to forgive him for what he's done. I'm just hoping that someday, somebody will fathom his mind. And whoever that someone may be, I hope they'll give us a logical explanation of what happened. In the meantime, as far as I'm concerned, it could have been anyone's son. It just happens to be mine.
At home in a middle-class suburb of Bradford, Sutcliffe was somewhat retiring, even timid, apparently leading the normal life of a married man. And yet, 20 times he had felt the urge to kill and had brutally attacked women, usually with a hammer blow to the back of the head. He would then return home, wash his clothes and resume a normal routine. A routine that would include warning his own sisters about the Yorkshire Ripper. One of his sisters took her own precautions.
One particular occasion when she came on with her daughter one night, it was dark, early part of the winter, before Christmas anyway. And she says, I've got the kitchen knife up my sleeve in case this fella strikes. So that was it. She actually showed me the thing that she had shoved up her sleeve with a handle in her hand.
With hindsight, it was a clue to Sutcliffe's complex personality. But even when he was younger, he was the last child his family would ever suspect of growing into a violent man.
He was only a small baby. He only weighed 5 pounds when he was born. Consequently, it took a long while to grow up and catch up with other children. Even when we had children later, he was still the one that was hanging onto mother's apron strings all the time.
Up until her death 2 years ago, Sutcliffe had a close relationship with his mother, nurtured in the home he was brought up in, the eldest of 3 boys and 3 girls. At home, he was a quiet child.
There was only one way to be with a kind, gentle, timid child, is to be kind back to him, and we're always kind to him. I mean, he loved his father and mother, and his sisters and brothers who, as they grew up, and some of them even outgrew him. But they were always quite considerate towards him. He rather shunned the company of other boys because they were always seemed to be much too big for him. You could walk past the schoolyard during the play period in the afternoon, and he'd be stood in a corner by himself. But he never objected to going to school at that age. He got settled in and he went regularly, no problems.
At the age of 11, Peter Sutcliffe moved to secondary school in Bingley, and it was there that he was made to suffer for his weakness.
For a short period after he went there, he did suffer a certain amount of bullying. And apparently for a couple of weeks, he hadn't been to school. And I found out that he'd been coming home and coming back in through the front door, going upstairs, climbing into the underdrawing and spending the day up there on his own. Now, when I found out about this, I asked him what was wrong, and he told me. He didn't like that school. Why not? Well, they're always pushing me around. Oh, I said, right. So I took him down to see the headmaster, talked it out with him, talked it out with Peter. He went back to school, and there was never any more trouble.
When he left school, Sutcliffe wanted an outdoor life. In 1964, he took a job as a gravedigger in Bingley. While he was in that job, Sutcliffe claimed he'd had a message from God. The story goes that Sutcliffe heard a voice which seemed to come from a Polish grave. Since then, it's been said he had a mission in life directed by God and not the devil. He said he'd heard that God encouraged him to wipe out scum. Another story about a handful of rings is told by an ex-gravedigger.
Be about 5 or 7 rings, you know, and he said, I've got these, you know, bodies, like, you know, and he says, my sister Maureen, we're getting engaged or something, you know, and she says, well, somewhat about these rings. Peter said, well, you've no need to go and, you know, jewellers or something and have one of these, you know.
One of the bizarre stories people tell about Sutcliffe, and it was around this time that the friends he drank with in pubs in the area began to notice that he had difficulty forming relationships with women.
The time I knew Peter for that roughly 2-year period, he never had a girlfriend.
He never had a girlfriend?
No.
Why was that?
He didn't seem to take off. His conversation, you know, at that time, he was a good-looking lad, there was no doubt about it, you know, in his own way, but his conversation wasn't really too good, you know, not much chat.
He used to ask me to, you know, if I had a mate that had make up a foursome, but none of my mates were ever interested, you know.
They didn't fancy him?
They didn't know, not the local girls, you know. They were just quiet, deep, you know.
Sutcliffe's first serious girlfriend was Sonia. At the time he met her, a 16-year-old schoolgirl. During their engagement, Sonia had the delusion that she was the second Christ and had been treated for schizophrenia. That was in 1972. It was the marriage in 1974 that introduced Peter Sutcliffe into a family of rigid East European disciplines. His bride was the strong-willed daughter of an exiled Ukrainian. It was her determination to finish her training as a teacher that made the couple wait 5 years before marrying. Peter Sutcliffe started attacking women a year after he was married, while he and his wife were living at her parents' home. By 1977, the couple had saved up enough to buy their own home. For short periods, Sonia Sutcliffe would leave her husband to his own devices, while she went on training courses outside Bradford. But outwardly, Sutcliffe did nothing to arouse suspicion. But in all the sort of warnings that the police gave, look at your next-door neighbour, even look at your husband, did you ever look at him?
No. No, never. No.
Why not?
Well, I suppose that I think everyone really thought that whoever it was going to be someone a bit peculiar or a bit odd. They just didn't expect it to be an ordinary, everyday sort of a chap, which he is.
It's a terrible thing to think that he's been sat there. And all the time we've been warning the kids and one thing or another, and he's been sat over there laughing tin at us, hasn't he, really?
The least of Sutcliffe's worries were at work, where his reliability as a long-distance truck driver earned him pride of place in a photograph hung in the foyer of the works offices. His employers could find no fault.
He was a perfect employee. He was a good worker, a hard worker. He was a very tidy worker. His appearance was good. We have some of his records. In fact, his last day of work, the 24th of December for us down here. They're immaculate on his records.
The funny thing, if I spoke to him rather sharply, tears used to come into his eyes. I don't say he was crying with tears running down his face at all, but He was a fellow.
He was different. He was the odd man out.
Sutcliffe kept his distance and he kept his secrets. In Scotland, on long-distance journeys, he formed a special relationship with two women he'd met in a bar near Motherwell. Teresa Douglas and Jean Kerr knew him as Peter Logan, the name of an acquaintance of Sutcliffe's. Using that name, he wrote often to Teresa.
Dear Teresa, he got home all right. And he would say a strange dream about me, but he didn't want to tell me. I put it in writing, but if he remembers, he'll tell me next time he sees me. He says to thank my brother for giving the bed for the night, and it was better in the wagon. And said I hope he could do the same for us someday. Only a bed we could share together. Because he was very fond of me all my life.
Did he ever try to have sex?
No, that's what we didn't understand. No, he spoke about it, but...
When you say he spoke about it, what do you mean?
Well, he used to say he was just not normal like everybody else. He used to say it's funny that, how he never ever says anything to us two. He used to talk and say, that's funny, there must be something wrong, because fellas, they're all the same. No. He says he liked sex, but when it came time, it was there, but it was no good to him.
In Scotland, Sutcliffe slept in the cab of his lorry parked near Teresa's home. There was only one occasion when he stayed at her house, in her brother's bedroom.
I went out of the living room, and my mother's sister, she said, there's somebody in your bed. And I said, who is it? She says, it's that fella. So I went up to the room, and he was lying in my bed. So he says, hope you don't mind staying. I said, no, it's all right. He was just lying there, staring away at himself. I just said to him, I said, has anybody ever says you've got right evil-looking eyes and that? And he turned around and says, he says, I'm the Ripper, but just like that, but I never took any notice.
When he said he was the Ripper, did you say anything back to him?
No, I said to him, well, whatever turns you on.
Towards the end of the relationship, Sutcliffe's letters to Teresa took on an ominous tone.
I know someday, honestly, I know someday there's something going to happen. I do love you, Teresa. Don't get upset or angry. I don't know why, but I seem to be getting more rotten luck than I deserve these days. Anyway, missing you. 3 wee kisses. And he said his luck,
That's the story.
That's the story. He said his luck was getting worse and worse. Anyway, no wonder. It's getting worse. He's writing up telling me.
And you never realised?
No, I never thought he was like that.
In 1979, with the killings at their peak, the police tried a new tack. This, they told the public, is the Ripper's handwriting. And on radio and television, the police revealed what they thought was their best clue, the voice of the Ripper himself.
I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, the only time they came near catching me was a few months back in Chapeltown, when I was disturbed. Even then, it was a uniformed copper.
Before, we know we've been looking for a man, and there are literally millions, and we didn't know where he came from. But now that we can localise the area, the field is not appreciably, as I'm sure you must agree.
The Geordie accent and the letters postmarked Sunderland sparked off a massive police inquiry in the northeast. Voice experts pinpointed the accent to the Castletown area of Sunderland, and the police tried to check every male in that district.
Mr. Bulmer, is it? My name's Clark. I'm a police officer with the Sunderland Police. We're currently investigating this West Yorkshire Ripper inquiry.
What the police didn't know then was that what they were playing in the clubs and pubs was the work of a hoaxer.
But they never listen. At the rate I'm going, I should be in the book of records. I think it's...
But there had always been doubters. Maureen Long, the Ripper's 9th victim, couldn't recognise the voice.
For quite a while yet. I can't see myself being nicked just yet.
Neither could Olive Smelt, survivor of a Ripper attack in Halifax in 1975. Minutes before she was struck down, she says a man spoke to her.
I said all along, he's not a Geordie. The man who spoke to me was a Yorkshireman. They really believed he was a Geordie. And I said, when you meet this man, if it's him who spoke to me, you will get a shock. And I think they have done.
You are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
Even the voice experts who had pinpointed a Castletown accent were having their own worries.
It worried us that perhaps the killer was being sought on evidence of the tape. For example, they were telling everybody, look for a northeastern accent. And we felt that they really ought to look for the murderer and the man who had sent the tape. And if it proved to be the same thing, well and good, but that it may well not be. That was really what...
Well, our first reaction when the tape was released was to be absolutely staggered that within a day or two, nobody turned around and said, I know that man. And the only thing we could think after a while, because that voice is completely recognizable, completely identifiable. I mean, his family recognized him. That's a certainty. But the point is, having recognized him, what would they do? If he were the killer, they'd got him. And if he weren't, because he had a very clear alibi, of course, they'd pass him by. And it became immediately clear that was a big possibility, and increasingly clear as the weeks went by.
Assistant Chief Constable Jim Hobson was in charge of the investigation at the time of the Ripper's arrest.
But when all's said and done, the public was left in no doubt. The man you were looking for was a Geordie.
Yes.
Which must have diverted you from the goal.
Well, yes, it did to some extent, but even within our investigation, we didn't eliminate people simply because they didn't have a Geordie accent. That was never, ever done by any of the senior detectives on this inquiry.
But how do you view it now? Do you view it simply as a mistake or something that you would expect to have happened in a way it's turned out?
No, it wasn't a mistake. Often you do inquiries on a murder inquiry that turn out fruitless, but they have to be done.
So you don't regret backing that belief that the man you were looking for recorded the tapes?
No, I don't think anybody in our force will regret that.
To what extent was Sutcliffe able to operate, having the knowledge that the letters and the tapes were not his work?
Well, with hindsight now, obviously, he must have been feeling very secure at the time that we were saying that the man we're looking for had a Geordie accent. That's obvious, isn't it?
What's also now obvious is that since the tapes and letters were first released in 1979, Sutcliffe killed 3 women and attacked 2 others. What's less obvious is how far police concentration on the new information originating from the tape and letter episode confused an already diverse and cumbersome inquiry. By January 1980, it had reached daunting proportions.
There are over 250,000 names in the main index. We have taken over 31,000 written statements. We have worked something in the order of 1 million man-hours, and the whole thing is massive.
So large was the inquiry that an incredible 5 million car numbers were logged and stored by computer. There was always the danger that Sutcliffe was already in the file and had been overlooked.
So was Sutcliffe in the file?
Yes, he was.
He had got into the file in October 1977 after the death of a prostitute in Manchester, when it's arguable the police came their closest ever to catching Sutcliffe. Sutcliffe had paid the prostitute, Jean Jordan, with a brand new £5 note. He killed her and hid her body, omitting to retrieve the money. 9 days later, the body was still undiscovered. Under the cover of running guests back from a housewarming party at his new home, Sutcliffe drove over the Pennines, moved and mutilated the woman's body, but searched in vain for the £5 note. The next day, October the 1st, police discovered the body and the £5 note. It was a strong lead.
We have established that that £5 note was released into circulation on the 27th of September, which was only 4 days before this young lady met her death. And we have established that it went to one of 3 banks in the Bradford, Shipley and Bingley area, and it's here where we are now concentrating our inquiries.
And it was at the Midland Bank, Shipley, that the £5 note was narrowed down to a batch of £17,500.
Once we have the information in our possession that people have got notes in this particular series, I think we can say that we can narrow our inquiry down to one particular factory or firm.
They did. Along with other firms, they went to Clark's Holdings Limited in Bradford, where Peter Sutcliffe worked as a long-distance lorry driver. His employer recalls the day.
The police came on and went through everybody and went through, checked all the dates out, they checked our clothing, checked with our wives if the dates that we said we were a certain place was right, and they came through everybody. They came again when the handwriting thing came out. We had to all to write a specimen handwriting for the police. And this is when they took Peter in the first time, because I believe that his handwriting was very near. They took him in and for further questioning. But of course he was sent home later in the afternoon. We also then came again, they came through, went through everything again, and they went through all the dates again. They went through all his log sheets again to verify the dates when he'd been to the northeast or wherever he'd been to. They went to our customers and checked up to verify those dates. So they went through everything. Obviously, they were checking through Peter very, very thoroughly. But of course, how could we suspect Peter? But the police had him 3 times we interviewed him. We'd all been cleared, and presumably Peter had been cleared as well. So how could we suspect him?
If he's been through the system, why was he allowed to slip through the net?
Because we couldn't prove that he committed any murders. There was no evidence against the man at that stage. He was one of, as I've just said, of 7,000 or 8,000 people that we were looking at that time. We were trying to find out where the £5 note came from.
How do you feel now about the fact that he was questioned 3 times and cleared?
That's my own opinion. I think there's something wrong somewhere, isn't there? That's what we feel pretty annoyed about, that this man was interviewed 3 times by the police. Something should have been done about it before. I mean, if the police had acted on sort of on their thoughts, probably could have saved some lives.
So who then gave him, if you like, the alibi?
Well, the sort of questions that he would be asked was, where were you at the time of this particular murder? And his wife would say, well, probably he was at home with me. But you can't take it any further than that, you see. It's very difficult when somebody gives an alibi to really pin a person down, isn't it?
Sutcliffe had slipped through the net, as he had done in the red light districts when police believed the sole targets for attack were prostitutes. During police surveillance, Sutcliffe's cars were spotted altogether between 50 and 60 times, and he was interviewed about the police sightings on 3 occasions.
When he was seen about that, like many other people, this was months afterwards. And of course his wife said, well, I didn't think that he was out that night. We'd no way of telling whether she was telling lies or not. But certainly, many people that were interviewed, and there were 21,000 people interviewed, just the same as Sutcliffe, on that particular line of inquiry, simply denied being in the area for obvious reasons. That got such a vast inquiry, we were never able to keep up with it. One eventually that we had to abandon.
If Sutcliffe had been looked at more closely, it would have been revealed that he associated with prostitutes. A close friend of Sutcliffe's was a man called Trevor Birdsall. His ex-wife claims that he spoke of his suspicions about Sutcliffe.
He used to come home and I used to say to him, has Pete gone home? He said, no, you'll be looking for a prostitute. He took me once and he says, I'll show you this, how he's a bugger for pros. You see, I didn't believe it at first, he was going with pros, you know, we were sort of engaged to her. And we went once to Lum Lane in our car We were following him. It was like a bit of a laugh, you know. And I said to him, I can't believe it. Look at him, he's a bugger. But this was years ago with this. And we did. His car was going all over Lum Lane. Pete's car, you know. His green Ford Capri.
And did you see the Capri stopping?
Yeah, he kept stopping and going, and then I think he must have picked somebody up, because when we went further down Lum Lane, his car were gone.
After the last Ripper killing, Birdsall then made known other suspicions he had about his friend.
This man wrote in anonymously and said that we ought to have a look at Peter Sutcliffe for the murders. At that time, the letters that were coming into the incident room, similar to the one that Birdsall wrote, amounted to between 500 and 1,000 letters every day. They did in fact reach a peak of 1,000 in one particular day. So you've got to look upon it in that context. This just wasn't an isolated letter. And of course there was no other information contained in that letter, simply saying, have a look at Sutcliffe, he might be the Ripper. After writing the anonymous letter, he called at the police station and saw a police officer there. And at that time, great difficulty was encountered with him. He didn't want to disclose his name, and he was rather loath to disclose Sutcliffe's name. And of course, that inquiry was being dealt with in connection with the anonymous letter.
How often did he say that he suspected Peter was the so-called Ripper?
Oh, a few times. About 6 times.
When did he say that?
Well, he said it again up to now. It was after the last murder. He said it then, and that's when he went to police and told them he thinks it's Pete. And then he said before then, when there was other murders, he says, I think it's Pete. And I wouldn't believe it. Or if I'd have believed it, I'd have gone down and tried to save others, you know. But he was right quiet to me. He used to say, don't say out. I don't want to split on my mate. And then, you know, he said they used to carry things in his car, like an hammer and tools like that, which an hammer was used, wasn't it?
According to Melissa Birdsall, Sutcliffe had told her ex-husband about 2 separate incidents, the first in 1969.
And what did he tell him?
That he'd hit a prostitute with a stone in a sock. He sort of hit her over the head like that or something, and she fell to the floor. I don't know if he'd been there to see it, but it sounded as if he were there, I don't know.
The second incident involved Olive Smelt, who survived a Ripper attack 5 years ago. Wasn't it a fact that Birdsall had been out with Sutcliffe the same night as the attack on Olive Smelt back in 1975?
Well, yes. He mentioned that he'd been with Sutcliffe when he was eventually seen. When we interviewed Birdsall, he did mention that 5 years ago he'd been with Sutcliffe when an incident occurred at Halifax. And don't forget, during that 5 years, Birdsall never really paid any attention to that incident and never even matched it up with a series of attacks or killings. It was only after the Jacqueline Hill murder that he wondered, and that's all he did, he wondered whether Sutcliffe could be the Ripper.
If Sutcliffe had been regularly in the red light districts of this area and other areas, and he'd been interviewed by the police over the £5 note affair, and he'd been named twice by Birdsall, once anonymously and once in person at a police station, why wasn't he looked at more closely?
Well, the anonymous letters didn't come in to the police inquiry until shortly before he was arrested. And I explained that obviously we hadn't got round to the stage where we were interviewing him about the anonymous letter, simply because the deluge of similar inquiries that were coming into the incident room at that time. One's got to appreciate that, so far as Sutcliffe was concerned, he was one of thousands of people that came into the inquiry on several occasions. And one's got to have evidence, factual evidence, to take the matter further. He certainly didn't come into the category where he would be shadowed or watched or become even a real prime suspect.
So how low down the list of suspects was he? He
Oh.
was in the system, he was in the card index system.
It was fairly low down the system. He was only seen in the red light areas of Leeds and Bradford. Leeds only on one occasion. Mainly, the sightings of Sutcliffe were near to his home in the red light areas of Bradford, and people always had explanations for passing to and fro in the prostitute areas.
Now, you've talked in terms of thousands of people being interviewed, millions of cars logged, thousands of letters coming in. Did the inquiry get too big to handle?
Oh yes, there was an occasion when we were completely swamped with the response from the public. Letters were coming into the incident room from all parts of this country and the continent. People were writing from Australia, New Zealand, and telling us that 4 or 5 years ago they probably had an acquaintance who they thought was rather strange and might be the Ripper, and giving a name to that man. And these were the inquiries that we had to follow. Certainly the inquiry did overtake us at the time of the Jacqueline Hill murder.
Well, if there was such an enormous amount of information, was there really ever any hope of catching him through that system, the incident room system, the card index system, the computer?
Oh yes, yes, I'm sure that eventually the system itself would have led us to Sutcliffe.
But in fact, Sutcliffe was never among the top 40 suspects. He was caught in the end in a red light district of South Yorkshire. His luck had lasted since 1969, when he was convicted of carrying a hammer for theft, although he now admits he planned an attack. In all, he was seen by police a total of 9 times, but eluded them until Friday the 2nd of January, 1981. At 9:06 that night, a prostitute, Denise Hall, was standing on a corner of Havelock Square in Sheffield when Sutcliffe's brown Rover car drew up.
I went across to him and he asked me if I were doing business. And he asked me how much it was and I told him it was £10 and he says, well, is that inside or outside? And I said, well, it's either. Can either go in or out. So he says to me, well, do you want to come? And he was ever so eager, so I decided I weren't going to bother and just walked away from him.
Just over an hour later, at 10:12, another prostitute, Olivia Reevers, was standing at the same crossroads when Sutcliffe's car pulled across, and Sutcliffe asked if she was doing business. Olivia agreed to go with him. She directed him to a popular driveway off Melbourne Avenue, a mile away.
Has it occurred to you that you're the last woman who's been with him in that kind of situation?
Yeah, it has. And it was frightening actually when I got told who it were. I was really frightened, and I'm just lucky. That's all.
At that point, Sergeant Robert Ring and Police Constable Robert Hydes were passing through Melbourne Avenue on a routine patrol. At 10:40 p.m, they spotted the parked Rover car and drove up to the front of it.
I peered through the window and I noticed that it was the police. And they came out and asked him his name. And this car belonged to him. And he said, yeah. And that was it.
What name did he give?
Peter Williams, that's it.
Sutcliffe then got out of the Rover when Olivia Reevers, suspected of prostitution, was taken for questioning inside the police car. He walked away from the scene to the back of a nearby building, where he told police he'd been urinating. While he was away, PC Hydes had noted that the rear number plate on the Rover was held on with black tape. By radio, the police discovered that both number plates were false.
When they found out that his car number plate wasn't right, that's when they decided to take us in.
Sutcliffe and the prostitute were arrested and taken 3 miles away to Hamerton Road Police Station. But it was when police discovered from his driving licence that he had given a false name that their suspicions were aroused. It was pre-arranged with the West Yorkshire Ripper squad to feed them details of anyone arrested in red light areas. When the check was made, a message came back. Sutcliffe was in their not happy file. The following morning, Sutcliffe was collected from Sheffield and taken to Dewsbury Police Station for questioning by the Ripper squad. Back on duty in Sheffield that night, Sergeant Ring heard that Sutcliffe had been questioned all day. Without telling anyone, he got in his car and drove the 3 miles back to Melbourne Avenue. He retraced the footsteps of Sutcliffe the night before. Around the back of the building and near a domestic oil tank, he discovered an engineer's ball-peen hammer and a 4-inch bladed vegetable knife. The reign of the Ripper was coming to an end. The next day, Sutcliffe confessed to the killing of Jacqueline Hill. As the press and the police celebrated, Peter Sutcliffe went on to confess in all to 20 attacks in West Yorkshire and Manchester. The sense of relief was overwhelming. The endless gallery of tragedy seemed at last to be stopping. After 5 years, women in West Yorkshire had come to believe that no newspaper was ever going to print a headline like this. But now the press is free to report that the Ripper really has been caught and convicted. But inevitably, they and other critics will still be asking questions about the issues arising from the conduct of the 5-year investigation.
People will say that over the years the police made many mistakes in the handling of this inquiry. How great has the pressure been on you to catch this man?
Oh, the pressure on every police officer, senior police officer, junior police officers has been extremely great. We've been under a lot of pressure to solve these murders. It had reached a stage when we'd had 13 undetected murders, or 11, 2 in the Manchester area, and 7 attempted murders. And I think that the reputation of this force was at stake. Certainly not the reputation only of this force, but the reputation of the police service. And I think this, that in the end, even though we've had criticism from the public, they can't take the fact away from us that we in fact solved these murders and we caught the man and he was convicted.
Die, you bastard! Fucking die, you bastard!